Tonight, the political furor over Australia's day of protests amid the deadly pandemic.
When it does impose unnecessary and unacceptable risk onto the community.
Matthias Common should know better.
Also, the pressure on police to allow fans into Saturday's AFL showdown at Adelaide Oval. As congregations reassemble across South Australia, why some places of worship are staying shut. And we'll meet the hip-hop artist giving back to Adelaide's north.
I've seen so many gaps in the north, and I think the creative side is the least I can do.
Good evening, Emma Rebellato with ABC News Sunday. Australia's medical experts are on alert for a surge in coronavirus infections in the coming days following the nationwide Black Lives Matter protests. Tens of thousands of Australians marched in solidarity, defying social distancing restrictions and political leaders who urged them to stay home, although the rally here in Adelaide went ahead with police blessing. As political editor Andrew Probyn reports, the protesters have also been sharply criticised by a senior minister in the Morrison government, who labelled them selfish and self-indulgent.
The people can march!
Defiant nationwide mass protest
Black Lives Matter!
amid a pandemic. The Black Lives Matter movement, inspired by the death of Black American George Floyd at the hands of a white police officer, inviting reflection about Australia's record on race relations, its high rates of Indigenous incarceration, the hundreds of deaths in custody. A moment of unified reckoning? Hardly.
I think it is incredibly selfish.
Cabinet Minister Matthias Cormann condemning protesters, saying they had recklessly defied medical advice and risked unpicking efforts to control the coronavirus curve.
It's incredibly self-indulgent, and yes, I mean, it does impose unnecessary and unacceptable risk onto the community.
Matthias Common should know better.
Labor's Linda Burney saying all political leaders should listen to a cry from the heart from those calling out inequality.
It struck me, listening to people at the protest, that they were very conscious of what the health risks are. And we even saw police officers in Queensland handing out face masks.
But Matthias Cormann was unrepentant, saying no one should forget the enormous sacrifices already made.
People have been unable to attend funerals of their loved ones to help stop the spread of the virus. But we're going to have a mass gathering of tens of thousands of people in complete breach of the rules that apply to anybody else. It is absolutely reckless.
WA's Treasurer Ben Wyatt says he understands the passion of protesters, but is anxious about the risk to those they march for.
The people who will be most under threat for an outbreak of coronavirus are Aboriginal people.
Medical authorities now on the alert in case COVID-19 was an invisible presence at protests.
If there were to be a number of cases that were to develop related to the protests, then that would be a game changer.
No time is ever entirely convenient for uncomfortable truths, but balancing a democratic right to protest and the need to protect the population from a highly infectious virus is devilishly difficult. If the protests do cause a spike in infections, everyone will lose if it delays the reopening of the economy. Andrew Probyn, ABC News, Canberra.
A South Australian MP hopes the official sanctioning of our protest rally will pave the way for football fans to return to the stands. He wants coronavirus restrictions eased in time for the long-awaited clash between Port Adelaide and the Crows at Adelaide Oval on Saturday. Patrick Martin reports.
It's the sights and sounds sports fans have been craving for months.
The wild beauty of it!
The showdown at Adelaide Oval next weekend will mark football's reboot without a crowd. But after a police exemption allowed 6,000 people to take part in yesterday's Black Lives Matter protest in Victoria Square, one MP thinks if big groups are allowed on the streets, they should be allowed in the seats.
You could apply exactly the same principles you did to allow that protest yesterday here at the football.
Frank Pangello is calling for up to 10,000 fans to gain entry to the match. He says with social distancing and good hygiene, it can be done safely.
Now is the opportunity for them to lift the restrictions and allow greater numbers of people to go out and enjoy themselves. And they can start that with the showdown this week.
It seems punters are on board too.
I think given that we have a very low number of cases of COVID here, I'd be supporting people attending Adelaide Oval for the showdown.
I think so. Seeing they allowed 5,000, I can't see why they can't for next weekend.
The government says the state's transition committee continues to discuss the easing of restrictions, including spectators at sporting matches.
We've let the police commissioner, the chief medical officer and that team come up with those, make those decisions, and we'll be continuing to let them make that call.
Both Port Adelaide and the Crows are open to having fans at the game, but say public safety must come first, and they trust health authorities to make the final decision. Both clubs say no matter the final call, they'll back it, but just when that will come remains to be seen. Patrick Martin, ABC News, Adelaide.
There's been another day of big protests across the United States. The anti-racism marches were among the largest seen so far and came as another memorial service was held in George Floyd's honour. North America correspondent James Glenday reports.
After 12 straight days of demonstrations, activists wanted these gatherings to be the biggest yet. Thousands of people took to the streets of Philadelphia and New York City. In San Francisco, the Golden Gate Bridge was shut down, while the centre of Washington, D.C. was brought to a complete standstill.
It's unfortunate for the reason that we're here, but it's beautiful that everyone is able to come together and do what's right.
In the country's capital, nearly a dozen different events were held despite the heat and humidity. The newly named Black Lives Matter Plaza in front of the White House was the focal point. It's taken on the feel of a street festival with musicians and food stalls.
Free water, candy, snacks!
Few here have much nice to say about Donald Trump's response to these rolling protests so far.
Honestly, I think he'd rather be much of a dictator than a president. I mean, hopefully we get him out of office and we get somebody in there who's really about the people and about the country.
In anticipation of today, the Commander-in-Chief's residence had been reinforced with another ring of fencing. Most businesses were boarded up too and covered with statements of solidarity after looting earlier this week, though things were largely peaceful on the streets today.
Many people here have been encouraged by similar demonstrations across the nation and indeed in other countries as well. They're hopeful now the eyes of the world are on America that politicians will actually act and tackle entrenched racism.
The scene was much more sombre in the state of North Carolina, where George Floyd was remembered at the second of 3 memorial services.
Not only did we lose a family member, but y'all watched as well, and y'all was helpless too.
Again, his family and friends called for authorities to urgently crack down on police brutality.
I'm telling law enforcement all over the world, if you see that mess, get it out of your house.
Some in the crowd were pleased by news 2 officers have been charged with assault over this incident at a protest in Buffalo, New York. But in a sign of the power police unions wield, hundreds of their colleagues protested outside the first court hearing.
Lock the cameras!
And shielded the 2 officers from waiting journalists before declaring the policemen were just following orders and shouldn't lose their jobs. James Glenday, ABC News, Washington.
Tens of thousands of Europeans have shown their support for the Black Lives Matter movement at protests across major cities. In Paris, they defied a government ban to take to the streets, one of a dozen French cities to host a rally. There were similar scenes in Germany, where big crowds also marched in solidarity. Soccer players showed their support, some going down on one knee. In London, a protester was trampled when a mounted police officer was thrown to the ground and their horse bolted. Earlier, large crowds had gathered peacefully, packing the city centre to call for an end to institutionalised racism and police brutality. Still to come on ABC News Sunday, the Long March for Change. The black families and activists who say they want to seize this moment to drive change for their children.
We'll be back tomorrow and the next day as they were chanting every single day until until a change is made.
That special report coming up. 4 teenagers have been killed in a car crash in Townsville. Police say the group was driving a stolen car the wrong way down a road when they lost control. 2 girls and 2 boys aged between 14 and 18 died at the scene. A 14-year-old boy was taken to hospital with minor injuries.
From my understanding, the person was the driver, but yeah, that will form part of our investigation as well.
The Queensland Premier has described the incident as tragic beyond words. A 6-year-old boy and 33-year-old man have died after a holiday house went up in flames north of Melbourne. There'd been 13 people staying at the country property in Tyack, and those who survived were taken to hospital with serious injuries.
A family holiday that ended in horror. This property north of Melbourne is a smouldering wreck after fire tore through it last night.
Obviously, it is a very, very traumatic event for all involved.
The blaze broke out just before midnight. Emergency services rushed to the scene. 13 people were staying at the holiday house. 11 were rushed to hospital. The fire so fierce that initially 2 people were unaccounted for. Authorities making the grim discovery of their bodies later in the morning. A man in his 30s and a 6-year-old boy perished in the fire.
Especially for the family members, you know, it's extremely tragic circumstances for them.
The getaway house in Tyack is owned by a large Italian family. 2 families were staying there for the Queen's birthday holiday. There were a number of children staying at the property. Bikes and toys were left where they lay. A witness describes seeing a wall of flame last night. Neighbours tried in vain to douse the fire with buckets of water and called emergency services. But given the house's remote location, it took 20 minutes for the first fire truck to get here. It's not clear if anyone was awake at the time the fire started. The arson squad is investigating the cause. Elias Kluwer, ABC News, Tyack.
A boating accident south of Sydney has claimed the life of a 5-year-old boy and 28-year-old man. Late yesterday, rescue crews were called to Bulli Point near Wollongong after a boat capsized in rough conditions. A rescue helicopter crew pulled 2 men from the water alive before the search was called off due to fading light. This morning, divers found the 5-year-old's body inside, and late today, they also found the body of a man.
Whether they knew the area, look, I don't know, but I'm not here to say that whatever they did was right or wrong. It's just it's a tragedy.
The local community left a simple tribute for the lost child. Police have praised the efforts of surfers who tried to save a man who was mauled by a shark at Kingscliff, south of the Gold Coast. A 60-year-old Queenslander was bitten on the upper leg while he was surfing and died of his injuries. Beaches along the Queensland and New South Wales border have been closed. Authorities say the shark is unlikely to be destroyed.
An ocean predator lingers in the waters of Kingscliff after a morning surf turns deadly. A 60-year-old man was attacked by a 3-metre shark while surfing at Salt Beach. His friend and another surfer tried desperately to save him, fighting the animal off and dragging him to shore. But injuries to his upper leg were just too significant.
Unfortunately, there was nothing we could do.
The men who helped are being praised for their bravery.
The actions of those people was nothing short of heroic today.
Lifesavers quickly cleared the beach and spent the afternoon working with marine police, trying to track the shark. This one off the shore was being closely monitored, believed to be the shark involved in the deadly attack.
We all know that's where they live, that's where they are, and to keep track of all the sharks out there is very hard.
Surf lifesavers say that until today there had been no recent shark sightings on the Tweed coast.
It's a very strong surf fraternity, being so close to southeast Queensland and the surfing coast of Byron Bay. It will send a lot of shockwaves through them.
Very sad for his family because of this mum bloke not going home.
I'm definitely feeling a bit shaky.
Even if authorities can confirm it is the shark responsible, police say it's unlikely it'll be destroyed, as it has left the area and is no longer considered a threat. Baz Ruddick, ABC News, Kingscliff.
Once again, the bells are ringing across the city of churches as congregations of all creeds grapple with South Australia's restrictions roadmap. Many places of worship have thrown open their doors for 20 people at a time, while others are praying the rules will be relaxed soon.
This may not look like church, but it's the family service at St Columba's Anglican Church. Families like the Blacks have missed their congregation.
The communities that are so close to our hearts, you know, it is hard not to be together. There's something about being actually physically together that's way better than Zoom.
We've been on the phone a lot, ringing people. We try to stay connected to the people we know, and also people who are perhaps on the edge of the church, so we've tried to keep in contact.
Inside the main church, pews are cordoned off and an online booking is required. There's no choir and no singing, but the Sunday service is repeated several times so everyone can attend.
Through Jesus Christ our Lord.
Adelaide's St Francis Xavier's Cathedral continues to live stream Sunday Mass, with only a few smaller Catholic churches reopening. The Glynde Lutheran Church is waiting until restrictions are eased to allow 100 people. Their worship at home online services have been so popular, more people are watching than regularly attend.
I think it's something that we could look at in the future to keep going in some ways as well, as a possibility for doing church differently.
The Sri Ganesha Temple has reopened at Oaklands Park with a steady stream of people, but only 20 are allowed in each room at a time. The Hindu devotees are from all over India, but there's also people with backgrounds in Sri Lanka, Singapore, Malaysia, Fiji and the US.
It gives us a sense of belonging, and it gives us something that we can identify with, and also reassures us of our faiths and beliefs.
There are strict rules in place, and priests have changed the way people give their offerings. The priests are hoping the restrictions are lifted by August so they can celebrate the Ganesh Chaturthi festival, which traditionally attracts up to 1,200 people to the complex. Until then, the devotees are just grateful to be back. Helen Frost, ABC News, Adelaide.
A shipment of South Australian produce will land in Hong Kong in a few hours thanks to a deal that's been struck to load it onto planes in place of passengers. The state government says Hong Kong is critical to reopening export markets closed off by the pandemic.
This South Australian underwater delicacy is headed overseas. About 30 tonnes of seafood spuds and sprouts were loaded onto a flight bound for Hong Kong this morning, and more plane loads of produce are due to fly out.
We've already got the Singapore Airlines flights going to Singapore, which has now been extended for another 6 weeks, and today is the first of the Cathay Pacific flights going to Hong Kong, which is again a 6-week program.
It's a lift for local exporters and farmers cut off from lucrative Asian markets and doing their best to stay ahead during the pandemic lockdown.
It's probably just a start, really. So we've had exports going throughout this, but definitely at a much lesser volume than we normally would.
The produce is loaded onto empty passenger planes using space normally reserved for luggage.
Prior to COVID-19, we have 47 international flights a week leaving Adelaide. So there's a little bit on every one of them. Of course, with all of those passenger flights stopped, suddenly we had no pathway to market for a lot of our exporters.
Some of the goods departing Adelaide today will eventually end up in Japan. The flights are supported by a $110 million federal government program to keep Australia's food exports taking off. Chris McLaughlin, ABC News, Adelaide.
With fewer than 500 active cases of coronavirus across the country, Australia's efforts at flattening the curve have proven effective. But it's come at a huge cost, with the nation staring down its first recession in nearly 3 decades. There are early signs we may already be on the way out of it, but as Alan Kohler explains, it's very much uncharted territory.
Life's starting to get back to normal. There's cars in the street, people out and about, even sitting in restaurants. Now, on Wednesday, we learned that we're having a recession. But is it over already? In fact, will it even end up being a recession, technically? The last time the Bureau of Statistics announced a negative GDP number for the September quarter of 2016 it was later revised up to 0. The time before that, which was the March quarter of 2011, the minus 1.2% was later revised up to minus 0.3. So there's a better than even chance that this recession will get revised away as well, since the March quarter contraction of 0.3% was small enough to almost be a rounding error. But Reserve Bank Governor Philip Lowe said last week that this is the biggest economic contraction since the 1930s. So even if it all happens in one quarter, that is April, May and June, it'll be a recession all right. But what is a recession? And don't tell me it's just 2 quarters of negative GDP. It's high unemployment. It's falling consumption. And collapsing retail sales. It's declining small business income. And it's rising government spending. So let's agree we're in a recession. But it's not just any recession, it's a real whopper. But hang on a minute. Recessions are usually a mistake, caused by an attempt to control inflation or by some booming market going bust, like US property in 2007 or the stock market in 1929. And the whole thing's a big mess. This one's no accident, it's deliberate. Maybe that means it won't be as messy and will end more quickly. That's certainly what investors think. Look at what the world share market is doing. Shares are booming everywhere. Alternatively, the share market could be entirely divorced from reality, which wouldn't be the first time. We just don't know. The only thing we do know is that real GDP fell by 0.3% in the March quarter, unless it's revised away again, of course.
Alan Kohler there. Australian industries, including steel manufacturers, are backing calls for renewable energy to get us out of our economic slump. A new report has found not only would it be better for the environment than fossil fuels, but could create 3 times as many jobs. Here's National Science and Environment reporter Michael Slezak.
It's taken 2 years and 2,000 workers. Dundonnell Wind Farm in Western Victoria is almost complete and ready to produce enough electricity to power 250,000 homes.
You'll find that there's a very large number of wind farms that are already approved from a planning perspective, that have a grid connection, a little bit of support from government, and those projects will proceed.
Ernst & Young agrees. The accountancy firm was asked by WWF Australia to crunch the numbers on a renewable-led economic recovery.
We really have the opportunity to be a renewable export superpower. We need to make choices right now that are both good for jobs in the short term and position us for that larger export opportunity.
The Australian Industry Group represents 60,000 businesses and sees the economic slump as an opportunity.
This is a fork in the road, this is a pivot point, and we need to take advantage of the opportunity. You never waste a crisis.
EY calculated that each dollar of stimulus going to renewables would create 3 times as many jobs as fossil fuels. The plan includes electrifying all ground transport, fast-tracking approvals for existing clean energy proposals, and stimulating a clean manufacturing industry, including swapping gas with electricity.
We can't just flick a switch between a fossil fuel past and a renewables future. This is a journey that we're on as an economy. But business is playing its part, and it is very keen that we continue on that transition.
Newcastle's Mollycop Steelworks is already adapting processes for its 500-worker operation.
We've signed a long-term agreement with offtakes from a solar farm and a wind farm in regional New South Wales. The net result of that is it's reduced our carbon footprint by 40%.
For this 100-year-old factory, the future needs to be different to the past. They already get almost all their steel from scrap metal and are about to install new technology into their furnace.
That'll enable us to replace carbon that's been derived from coal with rubber from old tyres.
The role for government in this is flexible, but it could involve building transmission lines, leading by example and shifting government cars and buses to electric power, and using tax breaks to incentivise companies to do most of the heavy lifting. The plan also calls for support for new industries, like this battery recycling and manufacturing company, mining materials for new batteries, equipment, and even fertiliser.
If we can make a circular battery industry, really it means that the resources that are needed to make new batteries are available through the old batteries. We don't have to rely solely on virgin material.
Industries new and old looking towards a cleaner future. Michael Slezak, ABC News.
Rival protesters and police have clashed on the streets of Lebanon for the first time since COVID restrictions were lifted. Anti-government protesters had taken to the streets of Beirut to continue to press their demands. They want early elections, an independent judiciary and action on the country's economic crisis. Groups of Hezbollah supporters tried to disrupt what had started as a peaceful rally. Lebanon's economic woes have worsened over the past few months, with its currency losing value and inflation soaring. And now to tonight's special report on the history of violence and racial discrimination that's grown into the Black Lives Matter movement. As we've seen this weekend, it's a message which has resonated here in Australia and across the world. Nearly 50 years after his assassination, realising the dream of civil rights leader Martin Luther King remains just that. 1 in 1,000 black men and boys can still expect to die at the hands of American police. They also make up more than a third of the prison population, despite African Americans being just 12% of the total adult population. There has been some progress, but activists and black families believe this moment must be seized to drive change for the next generation. North America correspondent David Lipson reports.
Any parent knows raising a child is no walk in the park. But when people of colour in America teach their kids about respect, it's a lesson often tinged with fear.
Be respectful at all times, because all it takes is a phone call for police to be there and a situation to be escalated. And I think that's sad.
A month before Benita Buck entered the world, her mother Twana had an altercation with police that changed her forever.
I was aggressively grabbed and aggressively spoken to while I was 8 months pregnant. And it was really a shock and a wake-up call for me.
She wasn't physically injured, but she's convinced it wouldn't have happened if her skin colour was a lighter shade.
There are a lot of people who wake up and they don't have a care in the world. They don't really have to worry, you know? I want her to experience that feeling of just being safe.
No justice, no peace! No justice, no peace!
African American children are front of mind for many of those fighting for equal justice in the turbulent wake of George Floyd's death.
Y'all don't understand what it feels like as a black mom to release your child out into this world. It's scary.
Claiborne Carson was one of those beaten by police and jailed during his generation's fight for justice in the 60s. Now a civil rights historian, he hasn't given up.
I was in Los Angeles when the city exploded in 1965, so that was more than 50 years ago. We remember what happened after Rodney King was beaten by police and the city exploded again, and that was over almost 30 years ago. So this is not new.
He says history keeps repeating because the conversations black parents have to have with their children are repeating as well.
You don't have to give the warning to a white child that a policeman may kill you. The person who is supposed to protect you may kill you.
Since the days of Martin Luther King, there has been some progress in the black community, particularly when it comes to education. But on many lead indicators, there's still huge disparity, and none more so than criminal justice. Since the late 60s, the percentage of African Americans behind bars has almost tripled, with black Americans locked up at 5 times the rate of white Americans. Tracy Brame spent her early career defending young men of colour in court. Now she watches with some trepidation as her own son comes of age.
His shoulders are broadening. He's now taller than me, and he has a little fuzz right here. And I'm like, oh my God, he looks like a young man, which both makes me incredibly proud, but makes me more and more afraid, kind of by the year that he's going to have an interaction, that ends badly.
Of course, many black-white interactions are positive. For best friends Maxwell and Finnegan, 3 months quarantined together in a country house in upstate New York was as good as it gets. Now they're catching up via video link.
Who wants to drive the truck?
Last year, a viral video of the inseparable duo touched people around the world, and it's making the rounds again.
People started reaching out, and we've seen a lot of things that said, wow, this is still relevant, and it's more relevant, I think, than it was before.
The need for change is something Maxwell's dad is now acutely aware of.
It's scary, and Alex and I will do all we can to protect him, but we can't protect him when he's not with us.
Nobody really knows who's next. It could really be any one of us. That's a scary feeling. That's way more scarier than getting out and protesting today.
Day by day, the crowds and the sense of purpose are growing, and the people involved seem determined to close the circle so the next generation doesn't have to.
We'll be back tomorrow and the next day and the next day, as they were chanting every single day until the change is made.
David Lipson, ABC News, Washington.
With restrictions easing, older Australians are wondering when it's safe for them to start heading out of the house to do the things they love, like minding the grandkids, playing cards or line dancing. Well, we've put some of the most frequently asked questions to the nation's Deputy Chief Health Officer, and unfortunately the answers are far from clear-cut.
Playtime on FaceTime. Grandparents Joe and Louise Boyne have been doing this for 3 months now.
It looked okay.
But are desperate to give their grandchildren a cuddle.
We're missing them. We're missing them.
They want to know when they can start minding them again.
Knowing that we're unlikely to catch COVID from them.
It may be appropriate to start hugging and cuddling if you're in a state, for example, where there's been no cases of transmission for quite a number of weeks now.
Deputy Chief Health Officer Michael Kidd says it also depends on if you are well or have underlying health conditions.
So it's not a clear-cut answer.
It boils down to how much risk you're prepared to take, I think.
Beverly Hasler is a canasta fanatic who pre-COVID had 2 teams on the go.
When it's safe to play cards again, because we're touching, it's something we have to touch, and we have to share the cards out.
And so if it's 4 people, that's probably going to be okay in most parts of the country. Much larger groups, that's not.
She's worried about bacteria living on the cards.
We have one lady who's 87 and she tends to lick her fingers and do that with the cards, so that's been suggested to me that's a no-no. So somebody bought her a sponge.
That's a bit yucky anyway, with COVID or without COVID. I think if there's ever a time where we're allowed to call out each other about our hand hygiene, this is probably the time, and we shouldn't take offence.
72-year-old Rod Evans plays the double bass. This is his big band in full swing.
Getting back together again with social distancing is manageable, I think. But you have to consider we're blowing instruments, blowing air all over the place.
I'd be very concerned about a brass band with players in their 80s and 90s getting together in an enclosed space.
And how about some boot scoot and boogie?
Dancing, of course, is a risk, especially if you're dancing face-to-face with someone.
So that's also a no. And what about the border closures? Many concerned seniors are asking, is it really safe to open them, even with infections now so low? And they say the messaging has been confusing, with federal and state governments offering different views.
Many people are feeling anxious about this.
He says it's safe to go shopping or head out to a cafe, but if you're sick, stay at home.
We all feel that it's going to come back again.
That's the million-dollar question no one can answer. For the Boynes, it's Groundhog Day. Still in lockdown, they're making toys for the grandkids, counting down the days until they can
hug them.
Yes, just be with them.
Yeah.
That's all we need.
Lexi Hamilton-Smith, ABC News.
Australian tennis player Alex de Minaur is unbeaten after 2 days of the exhibition round-robin event in Spain. De Minaur, who has a Spanish mother, has been based in Alicante during the coronavirus pandemic. The 21-year-old defeated Spaniard Pablo Carrero Busta 7-5, 6-4 in a match without spectators.
All right, there it is. Alex de Minaur, it's an impressive win. Very entertaining match. Both these guys plays at a high level. Little elbow bump.
De Minaur will face the world number 12, Roberto Bautista Agut, in his final match of the event. In the midst of a pandemic and the Black Lives Matter movement, a South Australian hip-hop artist is releasing new music with a message. Gabriel Akon describes himself as a black superman and says racism is no kryptonite as he strives to give back to the disadvantaged but vibrantly multicultural area he calls home.
Gabriel Akon is on the road in Adelaide's northern suburbs, the mission to deliver microphones to the area's rising hip-hop talents.
No way. Thank you.
With the local recording studio shut down because of coronavirus, the microphones are vital to continuing Gabriel Akon's community work.
I've seen so many gaps in the north, and I think the creative side is the least I can do.
For 3 years, Akon, who performs under the name Diaspora, has been helping polish raw talent of young people in the north.
Everyone's united in one thing, which is struggle. And no matter how talented you are, if you can't overcome that struggle, then at one point it'll overcome you.
You only get one body, so you gotta make it count.
Hey.
Nobody's the same, get it out of your brain that a difference is always ugly.
Music has been a godsend for Kaylu during an ongoing health struggle with sepsis, and she can now see a potential career.
The dream would be to be able to do my own things, like have my name out there and people be like, oh my God, I want to see this girl perform.
Then there's 18-year-old Philo, putting a troubled past behind him.
Eyes over, take a bullet. Would you die for me? Would you die for me? A lot of kids come up to me and say, yeah, I love that. I love what you're doing and stuff. And just hearing like that is crazy, that like just a little kid from a flat can inspire like another little kid in Elizabeth.
It's a hectic life for Gabriel Akon. He's just released his debut EP, Australian, with a direct message about racism that his South Sudanese community in Australia often feels the brunt of.
I don't understand why they using my people as a muse to inspire hate. Got me angry, heated like a fireplace.
I've been through a lot of things in my life, and at this point I feel like Black Superman. Nothing can really get me. And racism is not my kryptonite. It's something that I know we need to sort out and deal with and pull our heads in as humanity.
There's no doubt Diaspora will be leading from the front. Matthew Smith, ABC News, Adelaide.
On to the weather now, and thanks to Russell Hodder for sending in tonight's photo of a white-naped honeyeater taken at Victor Harbour. It was another very cold and cloudy day in Adelaide today. We reached a top of just 13.3 degrees at 2:15 after dropping to 4.2 overnight. Mount Lofty recorded a top of just 8. Across the state, there were some showers about southern agricultural areas and temperatures were well below average. It climbed to 17 in Port Augusta. Further afield, cloud over the coast of southern WA is causing the odd shower and storm. Low cloud over much of the Queensland coast is causing showers with heavier falls over the north, and that will continue tomorrow as strong southeasterly winds push cloud into New South Wales. So showers are forecast in Sydney with 17, a sunny 14 for the national capital, and just 13 in Melbourne and Hobart. Back home, it'll be cold overnight in the north, but fine and mostly sunny throughout. 20 for Oodnadatta and 14 in Whyalla. Further south, sub-zero temperatures are forecast for parts of the southeast and agricultural areas overnight. A top of 14 degrees in Port Lincoln tomorrow and Mount Gambier. And a frost warning is in place for the mid-north, Riverland and upper southeast districts. As for the city, it'll be cold again overnight, dropping to 5 before a sunny top of 14 degrees tomorrow. On local waters, variable winds reaching 10 knots in the morning with seas below half a metre. Sunrise soon after 7:15 and sunset just before 5:15. And we're looking at fine and dry conditions for the week ahead. Mostly sunny and 18 on Friday, but showers are likely to arrive on Saturday with 19 degrees. And that's the news to now. Thanks for your company. Have a great night.